Simon Allford is a founding partner of Architects AHMM and was recently elected as the next president of the Royal Institute of British Architects. So Simon, this year the NLA celebrates its 15th anniversary with the Changing Face of London exhibition that looks at the huge growth that the city has carried out over that period. So you've also grown to now being the 4th largest UK practice in BD's top 100. So what's been the secret of your success?
It's not a secret. I think there's been a kind of a commitment. We've always been interested in what we call everyday buildings. So for us, the commitment has always been that, you know, the schools, the medical centres, the offices, even the factories, as well as the lovely public functions, but those background buildings in the city we've always been interested in. We've always thought they're incredibly important, and in a way, if you can build, you know, a quality background to the city, certain buildings will need to stand out because they have important functions. But I think it's that broad interest that has allowed us to kind of flourish, because we've never been sectorised, we've never wanted to specialise. We've always thought that architecture is, you know, already a narrow enough field. Architects have given away lots of territory over the last few hundred years to others. There are many, many consultants now involved in designing and making projects, which is fine. But the idea of then saying, oh, we can only do one type of building seemed to us entirely inappropriate, but also kind of stifling. Creativity spins from the fact that you might one day be looking at, you know, some affordable housing, and the next day you might look at a large educational building, and then an office, and then you'll suddenly realise that actually the difference between the office and the educational building isn't that distinct. There are places where people go to share ideas, and, you know, positive friction and engagement are all important. And then, of course, you've obviously been involved in this idea of recycling buildings, reusing buildings. You then think, well, actually, if our buildings are very likely to continue to change use over time, what are we designing for? We're probably designing for a good circulation pattern that is memorable, a memorable presence in the city, great engagement with public realm. But the actual uses could and should change, particularly in a low carbon economy.
A few years ago at Blueprint, we published a book on CZWG called English Eccentrics. And I haven't thought of doing another book today, which is called English Pragmatists, of which I would have thought the work of AHMM is a key part of how you deliver really good quality architecture, but in a way that actually is deliverable and is enjoyable and actually very successful.
I mean, we always talk about legible, buildings that are legible and understandable. And we also talk about the fact that, you know, we have our clients and they're really important. We have the clients who use the building who may not exist when the brief's been done. You know, for any client, they don't, the user is not always, you know, delineated at least as people. And then, of course, there are the people who walk past the building, who might never go in it, but they are the clients, you know, of the city. And in terms of, you know, I think pragmatic is a bit like the word commercial. In architecture, it can have a negative connotation, but to us, the idea of thinking about how buildings are made and how we can, there's a sort of Albertian idea that I like to paraphrase, which is making a building where nothing need be added and nothing can be taken away. And, you know, there's so much regulation, there's so much layering onto our buildings that actually, if the buildings can be finish free, because the finishes are the sources from which you make them, the frame is exposed, the soffit, the walls, there isn't plasterboard, you know, then there's a sort of economy and elegance in that, you know, which is not unlike the sort of, you know, post-war ideal of, you know, brutalism and expression of materials. It's not necessarily about truths, but it's about economy generating an architectural approach rather than economy debasing an architectural vision. And I think there's that idea about the dreaded value engineering, but what that really means is there's some kind of vision that we're holding on to, and the reality of construction and budgets is kind of killing that vision. And what we'd rather say is understand the reality of construction, understand budgets, understand risk, understand procurement, and then take full responsibility for that and find a good architecture, and ideally on occasions a great architecture that comes out of that, rather than be disappointed by the process of building. Because ultimately, it's the process of building that makes architecture. But as Corb says, you know, at what point does building become architecture? And that's the challenge.
Yes, well, that was the first question which Pevsner put into outline of European architecture, wasn't it? A bike shed is building at Lincoln Cathedral is architecture. So obviously I need to try and rebrand pragmatic then, because actually I think pragmatism is a very positive force. It is also very resilient, and I think linked to the whole idea of long life, loose fit, which I think is quite an important mantra of yours, really, and I think is becoming more and more important as we look to the circular economy and resilient buildings for the future.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. When we did a project in Amsterdam, it's an international competition. We won. We built it over a 10-year period. So I mean, that's a reminder that architecture is kind of slow, and therefore it needs to be resilient. And fashions will come and go, but buildings have to transcend fashion. But in that project, we were taking an 800,000 square foot chemistry lab and turning it into a humanities building. And the building had an urban role, so we removed a huge chunk of the building that sat on top of a canal to release the land behind. And, you know, I did say in the interviews to the client, I would suspect we are the last people who will remain on this team, because in a university, the building procurement team will change every 2 or 3 years. And indeed, so will the brief. So what was our brief? Our brief in that building was to make it work in the city, which meant this kind of big structure intervention, and then to create what I would call the architectural promenade, the rooms and spaces that have critical social importance as you move through the building, that organise the journey, and accept that the rest of it, of course we designed for it, but that will come and go. And the law department wasn't in the building, then they came in, and, you know, certain humanities left and someone else came in. And I think that's, you know, social behavioural sciences came in. You know, I think that's really important, because in a sense, it's a bit like streets are the lifeblood of the city and buildings come and go, and actually the streets survive. You know, they might, you know, have some losses. There's a sort of collective amnesia. If you drop a building, no one remembers what it looks like. There's a, you know, it's a sort of known condition. And in a sense, therefore, with a, you know, long-term architecture, loose fit is really important, you know, long life. And of course, you know, I think it's Colin Stansfield-Smith talked about low energy, which is obviously ever more important. But it's really interesting to then think about what have we got control of? And I think it's the making the streets within our buildings, making the public routes within our buildings, and accepting that if they're memorable enough, the rest of the spaces, delightful and important as they are, will change. And we talk about theatre, stage, set and props. The theatre is the building in the city, and it's the journey through it. The props are the things that might last the stage sets might last 10, 15 years, the auditorium, the restaurants, etc. And then the props are the bits that come and go all the time, the daily life of the building as an organisation, academic, you know, or professional, evolves and changes. And that idea of accepting change and recognising that when we finish, the project actually starts its life. Yeah, we're gone, and then life starts. Accepting that you shouldn't be disappointed when you come back in 10 years because you don't like the chairs. You may not like the chairs, but if the building's good enough, the public spaces in that building are still alive and are being used and are being adapted by life. And I think, again, Corb said, life is always right. So you've got to accept that and design for it.
So if we look back at those 15 years that the changing phase covers, what are the sort of key moments and buildings for you personally and as a practice?
I mean, I suppose for us, I mean, we set up in '89. It was incredibly tough. That was probably very, very good. We won a competition for a bus station in '95 in Walsall. That was really important because it was about making a public building from a brief that was actually just a series of bus shelters that we gathered it into a building. I think we then did a school, Great Notley, in Essex, that was a low energy kind of model school design council. But then we got involved in a whole series of projects in London. You know, schools like Westminster Academy, health centres like Kentish Town, that were both sort of competitions we won, and then working with, you know, a client whose offices I'm in now, as in we rent off them, Derwent, London. We did the Johnson building, which was a keep and extend project. We did the T building, and we're still doing the T building, which is endlessly recycling these 3 connected warehouses. We then did the Angel building, that was adapting and extending a frame. Then we did the White Collar Factory, which was really learning all those things from those historical buildings designed by anonymous architects, as far as we're concerned. And now, of course, we have the kind of almost the most magical brief from them, was above Tottenham Court Road Station. And indeed, it started 15 years ago. We're building a new public space, Soho Place, a new office and retail development above Tottenham Court Road, and then over Crossrail, we're building a new theatre for NIMAX, all under the Derwent project umbrella. So in a sense, again, slow architecture, 15 years ago, that project started. And if you go to Tottenham Court Road now, you'll see the frame going up, which is always a good reminder of, you know, long, complex projects and the problems and the constraints of working on those complex projects in London. Actually, if you get the strategy right and you accept that change will come with time and materials and costs and other things hitting the project, actually, it is the mother of invention. So going back to your pragmatic thing, it's a kind of creative pragmatism, I think, that makes great architecture.
Crisis can provide opportunities as well as dangers. So how do you see the future roles, or the near future roles, of architects? I know you're going to be president of the RIBA next year, and I don't want to ask you about the politics of that, but more about the role that architects have, because we're in a period where we're rethinking so much about the built environment. We've got new planning white paper, we're looking at greener future, we're looking at more space in cities, a whole new safety regime for how we put buildings together, new building regulations. So radical rethink. Architect profession is in a great position to deliver some of that thinking and deliver the end products of that thinking. So how can you help, as president of the RIBA, the profession grasp those opportunities rather than really be defeated by the economic circumstance?
Yeah, I think you've pretty much covered that yeah, Grenfell, white paper, COVID, recession, extraordinary, and the cultural and social challenges, you know, that have been kind of brought to the fore in the last few months. So I think we were saying earlier, in that kind of dynamic situation of kind of crisis, you have to think a bit harder and you have to get down to the essence of things. And that, I think, is good for us as a profession. Architecture is incredibly important to us. I think the environment is incredibly important to society, which is why, you know, most architects are committed to what they do. But we've also got to remember that, you know, the world can function without us, and too often it has. And we've got to make sure that we're clear of where we can bring positive value. I don't just mean financial value, I mean social value, you know, value in every sense. And that, going back to that idea of having a view about operational energy and embodied carbon, and persuading through intelligent research and facts, persuading clients that this is this is the way to go. It is not that difficult, because any young person, you know, they may not be religious, but they will carry a torch for climate change and a deep concern about the environment. And if you're making buildings which are going to last, well, they should last 100 years plus. And if you are making those buildings, then actually, you can say to your clients, if we don't make a building that is kind of pushing and responding to the environmental challenge, people will not want to occupy it. So that's, you know, that's a leadership role we can play. In terms of, COVID, it's the same thing. Thinking about people movements in infrastructure, in public realm, and then in buildings. Again, that's what architecture is about. I talked earlier about the architectural promenade. How do you manage the architectural promenade in a post-pandemic world, make it delightful, and actually make that kind of, the celebration of moving through the buildings actually a joyful thing rather than a problem of people. I went to a lift recently where you're supposed to each stare in the corner and ignore each other. And of course, the reality of thousands of years of social, training means we all automatically break those rules down when we're gathered together. So I think, again, there's a huge opportunity for architecture. What can the RIBA do? I'm always optimistic about the profession, but we talk about, a kind of, a diverse profession. And I think for most people, diverse means culturally and ethnically diverse that represents society better, which I think is absolutely true and essential for the future, because a profession that represents society better is going to be more useful and better able to engage with society. But also diversity is to recognise that we are not one profession. We are very different kinds of architects with different scales of operation, with different attitudes. And rather than try and fit us all into a box, to me, the RIBA should embrace that difference at every level, bring all the different groups together and let the RIBA host debate. And don't try and come down on the side of good or bad or right or wrong, but accept nuance and difference and accept that actually there isn't, an absolute and clear route, and people will have different attitudes to the use of timber or how we sequester carbon, or whether actually this way of making a building is better than that way or that contract. But allow those debates to be expressed, articulated. The best work that tests those ideas to be celebrated through exhibition and awards. The public are interested in architecture. We have a fantastic website, an amazing series of buildings with an HQ that is a kind of fantastic quality asset we've never properly used. In my opinion, get rid of kind of, the sort of venues department and turn it into a house of fun, a house of architecture, a place of ideas online, as we were talking about earlier, and physically. And then we will be following our charter, which is to kind of promote architecture. And if we promote it to ourselves, openly, engaged in discourse, and the public, we've got a much stronger voice with government. And I do think the rest of the industry does look to architecture to galvanise projects, to galvanise teams, to offer vision. And what we've got to recognise is you're not going to get back a kind of post-war Honeywood Files architect role, but what you might say is a creative, collaborative leadership. And I always remember, there's a sort of, again, going to that idea about pragmatism or collaboration leads to compromise. I remember, Will Alsop, who was a pretty uncompromising guy, turning around and going, this consultation makes you think harder, makes better architecture. Didn't really always listen to everyone, but he listened to them. He didn't do what they said, but he did something differently. He was made to think harder. And I think that's something we should embrace.
Absolutely. I think it's very important because he was able to inspire people to accept things that they would have never have thought of when they first started that consultation. And
I think he only, he was obviously creative, but he was thinking differently, because instead of just being in, the dominant figure, he could then listen, engage, and then almost turn his own ideas upside down, as he liked to do anyway, but in a way that was responding to things he'd heard, as well as his own private pocket vision of how the world should be made from cigarettes and lighters.
Very good. Well, thank you very much, Simon. Thanks for your thoughts, and good luck with the RIBA. And thank you very much for your contribution to the changing face of London over the last 15 years.
Peter, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much indeed. Cheers. Bye.